Death at the Christmas Pet Blessing. Welcome, dear friends, to Velvet Clues. I'm Connor, your narrator for this evening's tale of mystery and murder most unusual. Before we begin, I'd like to ask you something. Do you remember the first time you brought a beloved pet to be blessed? That moment of hope, of faith, of community? Hold that memory close, for tonight's story will show how even the most sacred traditions can harbour deadly secrets. Now, settle in with your favourite warm beverage, perhaps with a faithful companion at your feet, and let us begin. Chapter 1. The Serpent Among the Lambs. The December morning dawned crisp and clear over St. Mary Mead, with frost painting delicate patterns across window panes and a light dusting of snow transforming the village into something from a Christmas card. Miss Jane Marple, carefully navigating the icy cobblestones with her walking stick, made her way towards St. Clement's church, where the annual Christmas Pet Blessing was scheduled to commence at 10 o'clock sharp. The tradition had been established some 15 years prior by the previous vicar, and had grown from a modest gathering of a dozen parishioners to the village's most beloved Christmas event, drawing participants from neighbouring communities and even attracting coverage from the county newspaper. This year, the ceremony would be conducted not by the current vicar, who was visiting family in Scotland, but by Dr. Marcus Bellingham, the village's most prominent veterinarian. Miss Marple paused at the lich gate to observe the gathering crowd. Children clutched baskets containing rabbits and guinea pigs, their breath forming small clouds in the cold air. Mrs. Bantry stood near the church entrance with her spaniel, engaged in animated conversation with Colonel Melchett. What struck Miss Marple as particularly interesting was the unusual number of people who appeared to be attending without animals, their expressions suggesting purposes other than seeking divine favour for their pets. "Jane, dear," called Dolly Bantry, spotting her friend's approach. "Isn't it marvellous? Dr. Bellingham has promised quite a special ceremony this year." Miss Marple noted the slight edge in her friend's voice, the forced cheerfulness that suggested underlying tension. "Indeed, Dr. Bellingham has certainly become quite prominent in village affairs recently." "Some might say too prominent," muttered Mr. Pettigrew, the butcher, who stood nearby with his elderly terrier. The dog wore a festive red collar but seemed subdued, lacking the usual enthusiasm dogs displayed at such gatherings. Before Miss Marple could inquire further, the church bells began their summons, and the crowd moved toward the entrance. The interior of St. Clement's had been transformed for the occasion. Pine garlands adorned every pillar, and the altar was decorated with poinsettias and white roses. Temporary pens had been erected along the side aisles to accommodate the larger animals, a pair of sheep from the Wetherby farm, several goats, and even Mrs. Harmon's miniature pony. Dr. Bellingham stood at the altar, resplendent in a dark suit with a crimson tie that seemed almost too festive for the occasion. He was a man of perhaps 50 years, with silver hair that suggested distinction and hands that moved with the practiced precision of someone accustomed to delicate work. Yet Miss Marple observed something in his bearing that troubled her, a tension around his eyes, a stiffness in his shoulders that spoke of a man under considerable strain. "Welcome, welcome all," Dr. Bellingham announced, his voice carrying clearly through the ancient church. What a joy to see so many of God's creatures gathered in this sacred space. As he spoke, Miss Marple's attention was drawn to several individuals whose presence seemed somehow discordant. Mrs. Eleanor Trent sat alone in a rear pew, dressed entirely in black, no pet in evidence. Her face bore the hollow expression of recent grief, and she clutched a photograph that appeared to show a golden retriever. Near the front, Mr. James Crawford, the insurance broker, stood with a covered cage that seemed unusually large for any common household pet. And there was young Timothy Morrison, Dr. Bellingham's veterinary assistant, whose nervous glances toward his employer suggested knowledge of something troubling. The ceremony began with traditional readings about creation and stewardship. Animals of all sizes and temperaments remained remarkably calm, as though sensing the solemnity of the occasion. It was during the second hymn that Miss Marple noticed Mr. Crawford adjusting something within his covered cage, his movements deliberate and careful, yet somehow furtive. As Dr. Bellingham descended from the altar to begin the individual blessings, starting with the smallest creatures, Miss Marple felt that familiar prickle of awareness that preceded revelation. Something about this gathering was profoundly wrong, though she could not yet identify the source of her unease. Chapter 2. A Blessing Interrupted. The individual blessings proceeded with choreographed precision, Dr. Bellingham moving along the front pews with practiced efficiency. Each animal received a gentle touch, a murmured prayer, and a small sprinkle of holy water that had been specially blessed for the occasion. Parents lifted children to better see the proceedings, and several photographers from the local newspaper captured what should have been heartwarming moments of community celebration. Miss Marple, positioned strategically where she could observe both the veterinarian and the congregation, noted several peculiarities in the proceedings. Dr. Bellingham's blessings, while outwardly appropriate, seemed mechanical, lacking the genuine warmth one might expect from someone in his profession. More curious still was his apparent reluctance to make eye contact with certain pet owners, particularly those whose animals had been his patients in recent months. "Such a lovely ceremony," whispered Mrs. Price Ridley, though her tone suggested otherwise. Her Persian cat, Empress, sat rigidly in her carrier, unusual for an animal typically eager for attention. It was when Dr. Bellingham reached Mr. Crawford's covered cage that the atmosphere shifted perceptibly. The insurance broker's hands trembled slightly as he lifted the cloth, and several nearby congregants gasped at what was revealed. Instead of the expected rabbit or parrot, the cage contained what appeared to be an exotic snake, its scales gleaming with an iridescent pattern that seemed almost hypnotic in the coloured light streaming through the stained glass windows. "Mr. Crawford," Dr. Bellingham said, his voice carrying a note of surprise that didn't quite ring true. "I wasn't aware you kept reptiles." "Recent acquisition," Crawford replied tersely. "Thought all God's creatures deserved blessing, regardless of their nature." The snake remained perfectly still, coiled in the corner of its enclosure, but Miss Marple observed how several people nearby instinctively stepped back. There was something about the creature's appearance that seemed wrong for a pet snake, too wild, too dangerous, though she couldn't quite identify the specific species. Dr. Bellingham hesitated, his hand hovering over the cage. "Perhaps we might discuss this after the ceremony. Some animals require special handling." "I insist," Crawford said, his voice carrying an edge of challenge. "Unless you're suggesting some creatures are unworthy of blessing." The confrontation, though subtle, had drawn the attention of the entire congregation. Dr. Bellingham's face had grown pale, and a thin sheen of perspiration appeared on his forehead despite the church's December chill. After a moment's pause, he reached toward the cage with obvious reluctance. What happened next occurred with such speed that later accounts would vary dramatically. The snake, previously motionless, struck with lightning velocity. Its fangs penetrated Dr. Bellingham's hand just above the wrist, causing him to cry out and stumble backward. The cage toppled, though Crawford managed to prevent it from opening completely, quickly covering it again with the cloth. "Medical assistance!" someone shouted, and Dr. Morrison rushed forward from his position near the pulpit. But even as he reached his employer, it became apparent that something was terribly wrong. Dr. Bellingham's arm had already begun to swell, angry red streaks racing up toward his elbow with alarming speed. "What species?" Morrison demanded of Crawford, his professional training overcoming his obvious panic. "We need to know what antivenom." "Eastern brown," Crawford replied quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the shocked silence. "Australian, one of the most venomous land snakes in the world." The implications of this statement rippled through the congregation like a physical force. Several people cried out in alarm, parents clutched, their children closer, and someone near the door fainted, creating additional commotion. Dr. Bellingham had collapsed onto the altar steps, his breathing laboured and his skin taking on an alarming greyish pallor. Morrison worked frantically, loosening his employer's tie and attempting to keep the affected arm immobilised, but the venom was working with devastating efficiency. "Ambulance is on its way," announced Colonel Melchett, who had taken charge of the situation with military precision. "Everyone please remain calm and stay where you are." Miss Marple, while maintaining her position, observed the various reactions throughout the church. Mrs. Trent had not moved from her pew, her expression unchanged, still clutching the photograph of her dog. Timothy Morrison's attempts at medical intervention seemed competent but futile, his face reflecting professional knowledge of the likely outcome. And Mr. Crawford stood perfectly still beside his recovered cage, his expression unreadable. Within minutes, the church had transformed from a place of blessing to a crime scene. Dr. Bellingham's struggles grew weaker, his breathing more laboured. By the time the ambulance arrived, it was clear to all present that the Christmas pet blessing had become the scene of something far more sinister than a tragic accident. Chapter 3. Questions in the vestry. The vestry of St. Clement's had been transformed into a temporary headquarters for the investigation, its usual atmosphere of quiet contemplation replaced by the businesslike efficiency of a police inquiry. Inspector Slack had arrived within the hour, his characteristic blend of competence and irritability on full display, as he attempted to impose order on what had become an increasingly complex situation. Miss Marple had positioned herself unobtrusively near the vestry door, ostensibly comforting various distressed parishioners, but actually maintaining a clear view of the comings and goings of those Inspector Slack had identified as persons of interest. The church itself remained sealed, with Dr. Bellingham's body having been removed to the mortuary for post-mortem examination. "Now then, Mr. Crawford," Inspector Slack's voice carried clearly through the partially open door. "You'll need to explain how you came to be in possession of one of the world's deadliest snakes." Crawford's response was measured, careful. "I purchased it through legitimate channels, Inspector. All proper documentation, I assure you. Import permits, dangerous animal license, the lot. Documentation you just happened to have with you this morning?" I anticipated questions might arise. The unusual nature of my pet, you understand. Miss Marple found this exchange particularly interesting. Mr. Crawford's preparedness suggested forethought, yet his claimed ignorance of the danger his snake posed to Dr. Bellingham rang hollow. She made a mental note to inquire about the timeline of his exotic pet acquisition. The vestry door opened, and Timothy Morrison emerged, his face pale and drawn. He paused upon seeing Miss Marple, seeming to wrestle with the decision to speak or continue past. She made the choice easier by offering a gentle smile and gesturing to the bench beside her. "Such a terrible shock for you, Mr. Morrison. You work closely with Dr. Bellingham, I believe." The young man nodded, running his hands through dishevelled hair. 3 years. He taught me everything I know about veterinary practice." "Everything?" Miss Marple's tone remained conversational, but she observed his reaction carefully. Morrison flinched slightly. "Well, the technical aspects certainly. Though lately—" He trailed off, seeming to realise he might be saying too much. "Yes," Miss Marple prompted gently. "You were finding some of his methods questionable?" The young man's surprise was evident. "How did you—" He stopped himself again, then seemed to make a decision. There had been some unusual cases recently. Surgeries that seemed unnecessary. Treatments that were perhaps more aggressive than required. "And did you voice these concerns?" "I tried. Dr. Bellingham didn't appreciate questioning. He said I was too inexperienced to understand the complexities of certain cases." Before Miss Marple could pursue this line of inquiry further, Mrs. Eleanor Trent approached, still clutching the photograph she'd carried throughout the ceremony. Her grief-stricken appearance had transformed into something harder, more resolved. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion evident in her eyes. "I understand you have some experience with unusual deaths. I wonder if I might speak with you privately." Morrison excused himself hastily, clearly relieved to escape potential further questioning. Miss Marple guided Mrs. Trent to a quiet corner of the church's side chapel, away from the bustle of the ongoing investigation. "This was Goldie," Mrs. Trent said, showing the photograph of a beautiful golden retriever. "She died 2 months ago. Dr. Bellingham said she needed emergency surgery for intestinal blockage." "But you had doubts?" "Not at first. I trusted him completely. But afterward, when I requested the surgical notes for my records, there were inconsistencies. The symptoms he described didn't match what I'd observed, and Goldie had been perfectly healthy at her checkup just a week before." Miss Marple studied the photograph, noting the obvious health and vitality of the animal. "Did you pursue the matter?" "I tried. Dr. Bellingham insisted I was simply grieving. unable to accept that I'd missed warning signs. But I know my dog, Miss Marple. She wasn't sick, and I've since discovered I'm not the only one with such suspicions. Others have lost pets under questionable circumstances. Mrs. Trent nodded. At least 4 others that I've found, all within the last 6 months, all supposedly urgent surgeries, all resulted in death on the operating table or shortly after. The implications of this revelation were significant. If Dr. Bellingham had indeed been performing unnecessary surgeries, the motive for murder became considerably clearer. Yet the method, a venomous snake at a public blessing, seemed unnecessarily complex and risky. "Mrs. Trent," Miss Marple said carefully, "did you know Mr. Crawford had acquired this particular snake?" The woman's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "How would I know such a thing?" It was not, Miss Marple noted, actually a denial. She was about to press further when Inspector Slack appeared in the chapel doorway. "Miss Marple, Mrs. Trent, I'll need to speak with you both. It seems we've discovered something rather interesting about our snake's provenance." Chapter 4. The Serpent's Journey. Inspector Slack had commandeered the church's meeting room, transforming it into an interrogation space that seemed incongruous with the children's nativity drawings still adorning the walls. Present were Mr. Crawford, Mrs. Trent, Timothy Morrison, and several other pet owners who had been identified as having lost animals under Dr. Bellingham's care. Miss Marple had somehow managed to secure herself a seat where she could observe all parties while remaining largely unnoticed. "We've traced the snake," Inspector Slack announced without preamble. "Purchased 3 weeks ago from a specialist dealer in London. The interesting part is the payment record." He paused for effect, consulting his notebook. "Paid for with a credit card belonging to Trent Electronics Limited. Your late husband's company, Mrs. Trent." The widow's composure didn't waver. "The company I now own and operate, Inspector, though I can't imagine how anyone would have accessed our corporate accounts for such a purchase." "The billing address was changed temporarily to a post office box," Slack continued. "One registered to a Mr. J. Smith. Rather unimaginative alias, wouldn't you say?" Crawford shifted in his seat. "Inspector, I've already shown you my documentation. The snake was legally purchased and registered to me." "Yes, but you see, Mr. Crawford, the timeline is curious. The snake was purchased 3 weeks ago, but you only filed for your dangerous animal license last week. Rather putting the cart before the horse, weren't you?" Miss Marple observed the subtle glances exchanged between several of those present. There was knowledge here that wasn't being shared, alliances that hadn't been declared. She cleared her throat gently. "Inspector, might I ask whether anyone has investigated the surgical records at Dr. Bellingham's practice? It seems that might shed light on potential motives." Timothy Morrison straightened. "Those records are confidential. We couldn't possibly—" "Couldn't you?" Mrs. Trent interrupted sharply. "Even when those records might contain evidence of malpractice, or worse?" The tension in the room ratcheted up palpably. Morrison flushed, whether from anger or guilt wasn't immediately clear. "I've been reviewing some irregularities," he admitted quietly. "Since this morning's events, there are discrepancies in the surgical logs, procedures recorded that don't match the billing, medications dispensed that weren't logged properly." "You mean he was falsifying records," stated Mr. Harper, an elderly man whose bulldog had died 2 months prior. "Criminal fraud, plain and simple." Inspector Slack raised a hand for order. "Let's return to the matter of the snake. Mr. Crawford, you still maintain you acted alone in bringing it to the blessing?" "I maintain I brought my legally owned pet for a blessing, as was my right." "Your pet, that just happened to be one of the world's deadliest snakes, which just happened to bite the one person you allowed to approach it." Crawford's composure finally cracked slightly. "You're suggesting I trained a snake to attack on command? That's absurd." "Is it?" Miss Marple interjected softly. "Or is it perhaps that someone knew Dr. Bellingham's habits well enough to predict his behaviour? His pride wouldn't allow him to refuse a public blessing, even of a dangerous animal. And if the snake had been agitated beforehand, perhaps by withholding food or other means." The room fell silent as the implications of her words sank in. Morrison was the first to speak. "The snake was aggressive, more so than it should have been even for that species. They're actually quite docile in captivity unless provoked or stressed." "And you would know this how?" Inspector Slack demanded. It's basic herpetology. Any vet student would know it. Miss Marple noticed Mrs. Trent had grown very still during this exchange. The photograph of her dog lay on the table before her, and she stared at it with an intensity that suggested she was seeing something beyond the image itself. "There's something else," Morrison continued reluctantly. Dr. Bellingham had a specific technique for handling animals during blessings. He always approached from the right, always placed his hand in the same position. Anyone who'd observed him would know exactly where he'd reach. Making it possible to position the snake accordingly, Slack concluded. "Mr. Crawford, I'm going to need a much more detailed account of how you came to acquire this animal." Crawford requested legal representation before answering further questions, effectively ending that line of inquiry for the moment. But Miss Marple had observed something else during the exchange. Several of the bereaved pet owners had shown no surprise at the revelation about the surgical irregularities. They had known, or at least suspected, before today's events. "Inspector," she suggested quietly, "perhaps it would be valuable to determine not just who had motive to harm Dr. Bellingham, but who had the knowledge and means to orchestrate such an elaborate scheme." As the group began to disperse, she noticed Mrs. Trent and Mr. Crawford carefully avoiding eye contact, while Timothy Morrison seemed to be wrestling with whether to share additional information. The truth was here, she was certain, tangled among these grievances and secrets like the serpent that had brought them all to this moment. Chapter 5. Records and Revelations. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the windows of Dr. Bellingham's veterinary surgery as Inspector Slack's team conducted their search. Miss Marple, having secured permission to observe through her friendship with Colonel Melchett, found herself in the records room with Timothy Morrison, who had been tasked with identifying relevant documents for the investigation. The young veterinary assistant moved through the files with practiced efficiency, but Miss Marple noticed his hands trembling slightly as he pulled certain folders. The weight of the morning's events, combined with what they were uncovering, was clearly taking its toll. "This is Goldie's file," Morrison said, handing over Mrs. Trent's dog's records. "The official one, anyway." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly. "There's an unofficial version." Morrison hesitated, then moved to a locked cabinet in the corner. "Dr. Bellingham kept 2 sets of records for certain cases. I only discovered this a few weeks ago." He produced a key from his pocket. "He didn't know I'd made a copy." The hidden files revealed a disturbing pattern. Each documented case showed 2 versions, one presenting urgent medical necessity, another showing the actual condition of the animal, invariably healthy or suffering from minor treatable ailments. The financial records attached showed substantial insurance claims and payments for complex procedures. "Good heavens," Miss Marple murmured, examining the evidence. "This goes beyond malpractice. This is systematic fraud and cruelty." "Worse than that," Morrison said grimly. "Look at the dates. The unnecessary surgeries increased dramatically 6 months ago, right after Dr. Bellingham's divorce was finalized. The settlement left him nearly bankrupt." Inspector Slack entered the room, followed by Sergeant Dawson carrying evidence bags. "We've found something interesting in Bellingham's office. Threatening letters, though someone attempted to burn them. The partially destroyed correspondence revealed fragments of accusations and demands for justice. One partially legible section read, "Won't get away with murdering innocent. Promise you'll pay for what you've done." "The handwriting," Miss Marple observed, studying the fragments. "It appears to be from multiple authors." "A conspiracy, then?" Slack suggested. "Multiple victims working together?" Before anyone could respond, a commotion from the surgery's waiting room drew their attention. Mrs. Trent had arrived, accompanied by her solicitor, and was demanding to speak with the inspector immediately. "I've come to make a statement," she announced when Slack approached, "but I want immunity from prosecution for what I'm about to reveal." The solicitor, a sharp-faced man named Pembridge, added, "My client has information crucial to your investigation, but requires assurance that her cooperation will be taken into account." They reconvened in Bellingham's office, now stripped of its former dignity by evidence markers and police tape. Mrs. Trent sat rigidly upright, her composure finally showing cracks. "There was a group," she began. 6 of us who'd lost pets to Dr. Bellingham's unnecessary surgeries. We met privately, compared notes, realized the pattern. We knew he'd killed our animals for profit, but we had no proof that would stand up legally. So you decided to take justice into your own hands. Slack's tone was carefully neutral. We decided to expose him. The plan was to confront him publicly at the blessing, with Crawford's snake as a dramatic prop to ensure media attention. The snake was supposed to be defanged, harmless, a theatrical gesture only. Miss Marple studied the woman's face. But someone changed the plan. Mrs. Trent's composure cracked further. The snake Crawford brought wasn't the one we'd arranged. Someone switched them. The theatrical prop became a murder weapon. Who else knew about this plan? Slack demanded. Myself, Crawford, the Harpers, Mrs. Price Ridley, and, she hesitated, Timothy Morrison. All eyes turned to the young vet, who had gone very pale. They approached me weeks ago, he admitted. They knew I had access to the records, could provide proof. I agreed to help expose Dr. Bellingham, but I never agreed to violence. I thought it was just going to be a public confrontation. Yet you said nothing when you saw the snake this morning, Slack pointed out. I thought it was the harmless one. It wasn't until after the bite that Crawford revealed what species it actually was. Miss Marple had been quietly observing throughout these revelations, her mind working through the implications. Mr. Morrison, when did you last see the snake before the ceremony? Yesterday afternoon. Crawford brought it to show me to prove it was harmless. It was definitely a corn snake then, completely non-venomous. So, between yesterday afternoon and this morning, someone exchanged a harmless snake for one of the world's deadliest, Miss Marple summarized. Someone with access to Mr. Crawford's home, knowledge of snakes and the means to acquire such a dangerous specimen. Crawford lives alone, Mrs. Trent offered, but several of us have been to his house for our planning meetings. Inspector Slack was already issuing orders for Crawford to be brought in for additional questioning when another revelation emerged. Sergeant Dawson had been examining Bellingham's appointment book and discovered a curious entry. Sir, Dr. Bellingham had a late-night appointment yesterday. No patient name, just the initials JS, and a note, final payment. JS, the same initials used for the post office box where the venomous snake had been delivered. The conspiracy was deepening, but Miss Marple sensed they were approaching the truth. Chapter 6. The Assistant's Secret. The police station's interview room had seen many suspects over the years, but rarely had it contained such an unlikely group of conspirators. Inspector Slack had assembled all 6 members of what the press would later term the Pet Justice Group, along with Timothy Morrison, whose role remained ambiguous. Miss Marple sat in the corner, officially there as a witness, but actually providing what Slack had grudgingly come to recognize as invaluable insights. James Crawford had finally agreed to speak without his solicitor present, perhaps recognizing that the truth would serve him better than continued silence. His story matched Mrs. Trent's in most particulars, but with one crucial addition. The snake was supposed to be delivered to my home on Friday, he explained. A corn snake, absolutely harmless, from a reptile dealer in Manchester. I had the receipt, the delivery confirmation, everything. But, Slack prompted, but when I opened the container on Saturday morning, I knew something was wrong. The markings were different, the size, the behavior. I'm no expert, but I've researched snakes extensively for this plan. This wasn't what I'd ordered. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. Yet, you still brought it to the blessing? Crawford's face showed his internal struggle. I convinced myself it was just a different variety, still harmless. We'd come so far, planned for so long. I couldn't bear to abandon it all. You're saying you didn't know it was venomous? Slack's skepticism was evident. I suspected, Crawford admitted, but I thought if I was careful, kept it contained, no one would actually handle it except to give it a distant blessing. Timothy Morrison had been growing increasingly agitated during this testimony. Finally he burst out, "That's not true. You knew exactly what it was. You asked me about antivenoms just last week." The room fell silent. Crawford's face had gone grey. "I was doing research. General research. Research that specifically focused on Australian snake species," Morrison continued. "You borrowed my herpetology textbook. The pages on eastern browns were bookmarked." Inspector Slack's expression had grown thunderous. "Mr. Crawford, I think you'd better reconsider your story." But Miss Marple's attention had shifted to Timothy Morrison. There was something about his vehemence, his detailed knowledge of Crawford's activities, that suggested more than casual observation. "Mr. Morrison," she said gently, "when exactly did Mr. Crawford borrow this textbook?" The young man hesitated. 2 weeks ago." "Before or after the snake was ordered?" "After, I think." "Why does it matter?" "Because," Miss Marple continued, "it suggests Mr. Crawford was trying to identify a snake already in his possession, not planning to acquire one. The question becomes, who had the knowledge and opportunity to make the switch?" Mrs. Trent had been watching Morrison with increasing suspicion. "Timothy, you were the one who suggested using a snake in the first place. You said you knew a reliable dealer." "For a harmless snake," Morrison protested. "I was trying to help you get justice without anyone getting hurt." "Were you?" Miss Marple asked quietly. "Or were you perhaps trying to solve two problems at once?" The young vet's composure finally cracked. "You don't understand. Bellingham was going to destroy everything. He'd started to suspect I knew about his fraud. He was going to dismiss me, destroy my career before it had even begun. He'd already started spreading rumours about my competence." "So you decided to eliminate him," Slack stated flatly. "No, I mean, not initially. I just wanted him exposed, ruined like he was planning to ruin me. But then..." "Then?" Miss Marple prompted. Morrison's voice dropped to almost a whisper. "Then I found out about my sister." This revelation caused a stir among the conspirators, several of whom exchanged puzzled glances. "Your sister?" Mrs. Trent asked. "She brought her cat to Bellingham 2 years ago before I started working for him. Routine spaying operation. The cat died on the table. My sister never got over it. She tried to take her own life last month. That's when I decided exposure wasn't enough." The room fell silent as the implications of this confession sank in. Morrison continued, his voice stronger now, as if relieved to finally share his burden. "I knew about the corn snake order. I intercepted it and replaced it with the Eastern brown. I have a friend at London Zoo in the reptile house. He owed me a favour. The snake was supposed to be destroyed anyway. It was too aggressive for exhibition." "How did you know Crawford wouldn't check more carefully?" Slack asked. "I didn't, but I knew his ego. He'd researched snakes enough to feel confident, but not enough to truly know what he was dealing with. And I was right there if something went wrong with someone else." "But you let Bellingham approach it," Mrs. Trent said, horror in her voice. "I positioned myself where I could intervene if necessary, but when the moment came..." Morrison's voice trailed off. "I couldn't save the man who'd killed so many innocent animals, who'd driven my sister to desperation, who was about to destroy my life. I let nature take its course." Miss Marple observed the varying reactions around the room. Horror, understanding, condemnation and sympathy warred on different faces. The moral complexity of the situation was evident. A young man driven to desperate measures by circumstances and grief. Conspirators whose quest for justice had been corrupted into an instrument of murder. Chapter 7. December Confessions. The December evening had grown dark outside the police station windows, and the earlier frost had given way to a gentle snowfall that seemed to soften the harsh realities being revealed within. Inspector Slack had been called away to consult with the chief constable, leaving Mr. Marple momentarily alone with Timothy Morrison and the conspirators. The young veterinarian sat with his head in his hands, the weight of his confession evident in every line of his posture. The others maintained an uncomfortable distance, as if his admission had transformed him into something dangerous, though several faces showed sympathy rather than condemnation. "Your sister," Miss Marple said gently. "She doesn't know what you've done?" Morrison looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. "Sarah thinks her cat died from complications. She blames herself for not noticing symptoms earlier. That's what Bellingham told her, that she'd missed the warning signs." "The cruelest lie of all," Mrs. Trent murmured, making owners blame themselves for his crimes. Mr. Harper, who had remained largely silent throughout the proceedings, finally spoke. "I understand what you did, boy. Not saying it was right, but I understand. When someone with power destroys the innocent and faces no consequences, it changes you." Miss Marple studied the faces around her. each marked by loss and the desire for justice that had led them down this dark path. Yet, violence begetting violence never truly solves anything, does it? Dr. Bellingham is dead, but your pets remain gone, and now Mr. Morrison faces consequences that will destroy his future just as surely. At least no more animals will suffer, Mrs. Price Ridley said defensively. That must count for something. Indeed, Miss Marple agreed, though one wonders whether there might not have been another way. The door opened, and Inspector Slack returned, accompanied by a woman none of them recognised, a sharp-featured individual in a well-tailored suit who introduced herself as Detective Chief Inspector Waverley from Scotland Yard. "We've been investigating Dr. Bellingham for 6 months," she announced without preamble. "Insurance fraud on a massive scale. We were days away from arresting him." The shock in the room was palpable. Morrison's face had gone white. "You mean he would have been stopped anyway?" 23 counts of fraud, 15 counts of animal cruelty, and conspiracy to commit insurance fraud across 3 counties, DCI Waverley confirmed. He would have faced decades in prison. The tragic irony of the situation settled over the room like a shroud. Morrison had committed murder to stop a man who was already marked for justice. The conspirators had risked everything for a confrontation that was unnecessary. However, Waverley continued, this creates a rather complex situation. Mr. Morrison, while your confession is clear, the circumstances are extraordinary. The Crown Prosecution Service will need to consider whether public interest is served by prosecuting someone who, while clearly guilty of murder, acted under extreme emotional duress against a serial criminal. "You're not saying he'll go free?" Crawford protested, though his tone suggested confusion rather than outrage. "I'm saying the case is complicated," Waverley replied. "As for the rest of you, conspiracy to commit public disorder is a far lesser charge than conspiracy to commit murder, which Mr. Morrison's confession effectively rules out for everyone else." Miss Marple had been observing Timothy Morrison throughout this exchange. The young man seemed to have aged years in the span of hours, the weight of his actions fully settling upon him. "There's something else," Morrison said suddenly. "The snake. It needs to be dealt with properly. It's not evil, just dangerous. My friend at the zoo, he'll take it back, ensure it's handled humanely." Even in confession to murder, the veterinarian's concern for animal welfare remained. It was this detail, perhaps more than any other, that illustrated the tragic complexity of the situation. Inspector Slack had been making notes throughout. "We'll need formal statements from everyone. Mrs. Trent, your cooperation has been noted. Mr. Crawford, you'll face charges for bringing a dangerous animal to a public gathering, though given the circumstances, I doubt the prosecution will be severe." "And Sarah?" Morrison asked desperately. "My sister. Does she need to know?" Miss Marple and Inspector Slack exchanged glances. It was Waverley who answered. "That's not a decision for the police to make, Mr. Morrison, but consider, she's living with false guilt about her cat's death. The truth, however painful, might free her from that burden." As the formal process of statements and charges began, Miss Marple found herself at the window, watching the snow fall on St. Mary Mead. The village would recover from this scandal, as it had from others, but the scars would remain, in the families who'd lost beloved pets, in the conspirators who'd sought justice through deception, and most of all in Timothy Morrison, whose grief and fear had led him to cross a line from which there was no return. The Christmas pet blessing, meant to celebrate the innocent love between humans and animals, had instead revealed the darker impulses that could corrupt even the most compassionate hearts when justice seemed out of reach. Chapter 8. The Truthful Heart. 3 days had passed since the tragic events at St. Clement's Church, and St. Mary Mead was struggling to return to its normal Christmas preparations. The scandal had dominated local conversation, with opinions sharply divided between those who condemned Timothy Morrison as a cold-blooded killer and those who saw him as a victim of circumstances driven to desperate action. Miss Marple found herself at the vicarage, having been invited by the newly returned Reverend Clement to discuss the possibility of holding a memorial service. The vicar, a thoughtful man in his 60s, seemed troubled by more than just the logistics of such an arrangement. "It's the moral dimension that disturbs me, Miss Marple," he confessed, pouring tea in his study. How does one memorialize a man who caused such suffering, yet also acknowledge the pain of those he wronged? Perhaps, Miss Marple suggested, the service should focus not on Dr. Bellingham himself, but on healing for the entire community, including the animals who suffered. Their discussion was interrupted by the arrival of Sarah Morrison, Timothy's sister. She was a slight young woman with her brother's earnest features but bearing the hollow look of prolonged grief. The vicar excused himself, sensing this was a conversation requiring privacy. "Miss Marple," Sarah began hesitantly, "Timothy asked me to come see you. He said you would tell me the truth." Miss Marple studied the young woman carefully. "The truth can be painful, my dear. Are you certain you wish to hear it?" "I've been living with guilt for 2 years," Sarah replied. "Timothy's in custody for murder, and everyone says it's connected to what happened to those pets, but no one will tell me exactly what occurred. Please, I need to know." So Miss Marple told her, gently but completely, about Dr. Bellingham's fraud, about the unnecessary surgery that had killed her cat, and about how Timothy's discovery of this had contributed to his tragic decision. Sarah listened in silence, tears streaming down her face. "Then Whiskers didn't die because I missed something," she whispered. "No, my dear. Your cat was perfectly healthy. Dr. Bellingham killed her for money." Sarah's grief transformed into anger, then resolution. "I want to testify. At Timothy's trial, the jury needs to know what drove him to this." Before Miss Marple could respond, Mrs. Trent appeared in the doorway. She had clearly been crying, her usual composure entirely abandoned. "I've just come from seeing James Crawford," she announced. "He's attempted suicide. He's in hospital, stable. But—" she sank into a chair. "He left a note confessing that he knew the snake was venomous. He'd figured it out Saturday night, but thought he could control the situation." This revelation cast the entire tragedy in yet another light. Crawford had knowingly brought a deadly weapon to the blessing, making him potentially guilty of manslaughter if not murder. "But why?" Sarah asked. "Why would he still bring it?" Mrs. Trent's voice was bitter. "Because he wanted Bellingham dead too. His daughter— I didn't know this before. His daughter was Dr. Bellingham's veterinary student 5 years ago. Bellingham destroyed her career with false accusations of incompetence after she rejected his advances. She never practiced again." Miss Marple absorbed this information thoughtfully. The web of Dr. Bellingham's victims was even wider than they'd known. How many others had suffered in silence? "There's to be a hearing tomorrow," Mrs. Trent continued, "to determine if Timothy should be granted bail. Several of us plan to speak on his behalf." "Including Mr. Crawford?" Miss Marple inquired. "If he recovers sufficiently. His confession complicates things enormously. If he knew the snake was deadly and said nothing, he shares culpability for Bellingham's death." The 3 women sat in contemplative silence, each processing the moral complexities of the situation. Finally, Sarah spoke. "I want to see Timothy." "That can be arranged," Mrs. Trent said. "I have some influence with the authorities now, given my cooperation." As they prepared to leave, Miss Marple noticed a file Mrs. Trent had been carrying. "What's that?" "Records from Bellingham's practice. The authorities released them to the victims' families. 23 confirmed cases of unnecessary surgery resulting in death, and those are just the ones with clear documentation. The real number is probably higher." "All for money?" Sarah asked, incredulous. "Approximately £40,000 over 18 months, Mrs. Trent confirmed. He was buying his way out of bankruptcy with the lives of our pets." Miss Marple walked them to the door, her mind turning over the tragedy's many facets. In her experience, murder often arose from a single passionate moment or calculated greed. This case presented something different, a collision of multiple tragedies, where victim and perpetrator were difficult to clearly distinguish. That evening, she received a telephone call from Inspector Slack. "Thought you'd want to know," he said. "The Crown Prosecution Service is considering a manslaughter charge rather than murder for Morrison, given the circumstances. And Crawford, if he recovers, will likely face the same." "And the others?" "Suspended sentences, most likely. Community service. The CPS recognises they were victims too." After ending the call, Miss Marple sat in her comfortable chair, looking out at the peaceful village. Tomorrow would bring more revelations, more complications. But perhaps, eventually, healing could begin. Chapter 9. Justice and Forgiveness. The bail hearing for Timothy Morrison took place on a grey Thursday morning that seemed to reflect the sombre mood of all involved. The small courtroom was packed with villagers, journalists, and what appeared to be every pet owner who had suffered under Dr. Bellingham's fraudulent practices. Miss Marple had secured a seat near the front, where she could observe both Timothy and the various witnesses who would speak. Timothy looked haggard but composed, wearing a borrowed suit that hung loosely on his frame. He had clearly lost weight during his brief incarceration. His sister Sarah sat directly behind him, her presence a visible source of strength. The prosecutor, a stern woman named Ms. Hendricks, outlined the case with clinical precision. The defendant has confessed to deliberately replacing a harmless snake with a deadly one, knowing it would likely result in Dr. Bellingham's death. This premeditated act resulted in a man's death, regardless of the victim's own crimes. But when the defense began calling character witnesses, a different picture emerged. Pet owner after pet owner testified about Dr. Bellingham's cruelties, about beloved animals lost to his greed, about the devastating emotional and financial toll of his deceptions. Mrs. Harper, an elderly woman whose testimony was particularly moving, spoke of her late husband's dog. That spaniel was all I had left of George. When Bellingham killed him for profit, he killed a part of me too. I don't condone what Timothy did, but I understand the rage that drove him. Then came a surprise witness, Dr. Elizabeth Manning, Crawford's daughter. She had driven down from Scotland upon hearing of her father's suicide attempt. Her testimony revealed yet another dimension to Bellingham's crimes. He destroyed my career with false accusations because I refused his advances, she stated clearly. But worse, he then used my father's guilt and anger about it to manipulate him. Dad started receiving anonymous letters 6 months ago, detailing Bellingham's pet surgeries, knowing it would enrage him. We now know Bellingham sent those letters himself. The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs. The magistrate called for order as this new revelation sank in. Why would Bellingham incriminate himself? The defence barrister asked. He wasn't incriminating himself, Dr. Manning explained. The letters were vague, could never be used as evidence, but he knew my father would investigate, would discover the truth, and would want revenge. Bellingham had gambling debts to dangerous people. I believe he was setting my father up to attack him, planning to claim self-defence and sue for damages. Miss Marple found herself reassessing everything she thought she knew about the case. If Bellingham had been orchestrating his own attack, the moral dimension shifted yet again. Timothy Morrison was called to speak on his own behalf. His voice was steady but filled with remorse. I took a life, he said simply. Nothing justifies that. But when I learned about my sister's cat, about all the others, and then discovered he was going to destroy my career too, I couldn't see another way. I thought the legal system had failed us all. It hadn't, Inspector Slack interjected from the witness box. We were days away from arresting him. But we didn't know that, Timothy replied. We only knew our pain and his continued success. The magistrate, an elderly man with penetrating eyes, had listened to all testimony in silence. Finally he spoke. This case presents extraordinary circumstances. The deceased was himself a serial criminal, whose actions caused immense suffering. The defendant, while guilty of a terrible crime, acted not from greed or malice, but from a misguided sense of justice born of genuine anguish. He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. However, we cannot condone vigilante justice, no matter how sympathetic the cause. Mr. Morrison, I am granting you bail with strict conditions. You will surrender your veterinary license immediately, report daily to the police station, and undergo psychiatric evaluation and treatment. Your trial will determine your ultimate fate, but I see no benefit to society in keeping you imprisoned until then. The courtroom erupted in mixed reactions. Relief, approval, some dissent. Timothy collapsed into his chair, overcome with emotion, while Sarah embraced him over the barrier. Outside the courthouse, Miss Marple encountered James Crawford in a wheelchair, having discharged himself from hospital to attend the hearing. He looked aged beyond his years, the weight of his own culpability etched on his face. I should have stopped it, he said to her. When I realized what the snake was, I should have refused to bring it, but I wanted him dead too. God help me, I wanted him dead. And now you must live with that knowledge, Miss Marple replied gently. Perhaps that is punishment enough. As the crowd dispersed, she noticed Timothy Morrison standing apart with his sister, looking lost despite his temporary freedom. The young man who had entered veterinary medicine to save animals had ended up taking a human life. The tragedy of it was overwhelming. What do I do now? She heard him ask Sarah. How do I live with what I've done? You help me heal, Sarah replied firmly. And you help others heal, not as a vet, but as someone who understands loss and guilt and the terrible price of justice. Miss Marple walked slowly home through the village, passing St. Clement's church where the tragedy had unfolded. The Christmas decorations were still in place, somewhat incongruous now with their cheerful promise of peace and goodwill. Chapter 10. The Serpent's Shadow. Christmas Eve arrived in St. Mary Mead with a gentle snowfall that seemed determined to cover the village's recent trauma in a blanket of pristine white. Miss Marple stood at her window, watching the parishioners make their way to St. Clement's for the evening service. The church had been reconsecrated after the police investigation concluded, but she wondered how many would be able to forget what had transpired there just a week ago. A knock at her door interrupted her contemplation. She found Timothy Morrison standing on her doorstep, accompanied by his sister Sarah. Both were dressed for church, though Timothy's expression suggested deep uncertainty about the wisdom of attending. Miss Marple, he began hesitantly. Sarah thinks we should go to the service, but after what happened? The church is a place for sinners seeking redemption, not just saints, Miss Marple replied gently. Perhaps especially for sinners. She invited them in for tea, sensing they needed to talk before facing the congregation. As they settled in her sitting room, Timothy produced an envelope from his pocket. I received this today, from Dr. Manning, Crawford's daughter. The letter was brief but powerful. I forgive you. My father and I both played our parts in this tragedy. Dr. Bellingham corrupted everything he touched, including those who sought justice against him. Don't let his evil claim another victim by destroying yourself with guilt. Live, heal, and honour those we lost by being better than we were. Mr. Crawford, Miss Marple inquired. Recovering, Sarah answered. He's pleaded guilty to manslaughter charges. Like Timothy, he'll face trial in the new year. They sat in contemplative silence until the church bells began to ring, calling the faithful to service. Miss Marple rose, collecting her coat and hat. Shall we go together? She suggested. I find that facing difficult moments is easier with companions. The church was fuller than might have been expected, the community seemingly drawn together by shared tragedy rather than driven apart. Reverend Clement had chosen his sermon carefully, speaking of redemption, forgiveness, and the dangerous pursuit of earthly justice at the expense of mercy. Miss Marple noticed Mrs. Trent sitting with several other members of the conspiracy, their group both united and isolated within the larger congregation. The Harper family occupied a pew near the back, their grief for their lost dog now complicated by their involvement in the failed plot. During the prayer for the departed, Reverend Clement did something unexpected. We pray not only for the human souls lost to us, but for all the innocent creatures who suffered. May their memory inspire us to greater compassion and proper stewardship of the vulnerable beings entrusted to our care. A soft sob came from somewhere in the congregation. Miss Marple couldn't identify who, but it seemed to release something in the gathering. The rigid tension that had held them all began to ease slightly. After the service, as people filed out into the snowy evening, Miss Marple found herself approached by Detective Chief Inspector Waverley, who had apparently attended the service incognito. You'll be interested to know, she said quietly. We've uncovered evidence that Dr. Bellingham was planning to flee the country. He'd booked a flight for December 26th under a false name. He knew we were closing in. So the confrontation at the pet blessing might have been his last chance to be exposed publicly, Miss Marple mused. More than that. We found a suicide note in his home, dated the morning of the blessing but never sent. He knew his crimes would be revealed and couldn't face the consequences. It's possible he allowed the snake to bite him deliberately. This final revelation cast everything in yet another light. Had Bellingham orchestrated his own death, using Timothy's switch snake as an unwitting instrument of suicide? The moral complexities seemed endless. As the congregation dispersed into the snowy night, Miss Marple walked with Timothy and Sarah Morrison. They passed the spot where the pet blessing would have concluded, now marked only by a small memorial plaque that had been installed that morning. In memory of all God's creatures who suffered through human failings, may we learn to be worthy of their trust. What will you do now? Miss Marple asked Timothy. Community service at the animal shelter, he replied. The court approved it as part of my bail conditions. I can't practice veterinary medicine, but I can still help animals in other ways. And I'm returning to my teaching, Sarah added. With the truth about Whiskers known, I can finally grieve properly and move forward. They paused at the church gate, looking back at the ancient building, now softly illuminated by snow and moonlight. It's strange, Timothy reflected. A week ago, I thought justice meant making Bellingham pay for his crimes. Now, I understand that true justice isn't about punishment. It's about preventing future harm and healing present wounds. Miss Marple nodded approvingly. Wisdom often comes at a terrible price, Mr. Morrison. The question is whether we learn from it or let it destroy us. As they parted ways, Miss Marple continued her walk home alone, her footsteps muffled by the fresh snow. Connor, the narrator in her mind, would conclude this tale with observations about the nature of justice and mercy, about how the desire to protect the innocent could lead to terrible choices, and how even the most pastoral settings could harbour the darkest human impulses. But for now, she simply walked through the quiet village, grateful that this particular chapter of darkness had closed, even as she remained watchful for whatever shadows might next disturb the peace of St. Mary Mead. The end. Dear friends of Velvet Clues, this has been Connor, bringing you another Miss Marple mystery. Thank you for joining us on this journey through darkness to understanding. Remember, justice without mercy is merely vengeance, and even the most justified anger can lead us astray. Until next time, keep your hearts warm and your minds sharp.